Now, one of the things it's not a real secret with me is how big a fan I am of the pugnacious fighters produced by Grumman in World War II. Honestly, the fighters they come out with are, pound for pound, some of the best aircraft I think have ever been built, let alone in World War II. I will agree with the argument that, in many ways, the Corsair is probably the better overall fighter. But in terms of ability to produce, in terms of ability to service needs, in terms of ability to fulfill all the roles required, I will still sit beside firmly the Hellcat. Because look at it. Look at this pugnacious aircraft. And probably my favourite aircraft of World War II is the Wildcat. In fact, the absolute number one picture for me in my entire PhD thesis is me standing between the Wildcat and the Hellcat at Duxford. And that was a really, really great moment for me. It was taken by my friend Sam, who, as you've seen in some of the Christmas videos, turns to turn as my producer photographer when I need someone. And she's a scout leader, scout mistress. And so she brought their mascot along with them. So the one annoying thing in that picture is the mascot's in there as well. But you know, that adds colour. That adds extra thing. Adds something to it. But yes, that picture, it means a lot. And I will always firmly believe that if the Royal Navy had got control of the Fleet Air Arm earlier and procurement earlier, in let's say 1939, the award was made in 1937, it took 2 years to implement. If it had been implemented fully in 1938, they could well have realised they weren't going to get a fighter earlier. In which case, from British industry, because of the Air Ministry and the way it was needing to control things and act to procurement. And I wouldn't have been surprised, therefore, if the Wildcat or something like that had been ordered earlier. Honestly, the British had no qualms about ordering from America at that point. America was a very reliable weapons manufacturer, and again, one of the advantages with America at that point was you could buy a lot of the manufacturing machining tools. This is something which is often forgotten about with the British in World War II and its growing capabilities. When we are seeking to expand our factories and capabilities of production rapidly between from 1937 onwards, and especially 1939 to 1941, I mean, the British buy a lot of machinery tools from the Americans. We build a lot of our own, but again, we are doing war production, we are mobilizing personnel to go into the military in 1939 onwards, and we're also trying to grow military factories. We don't have enough population to go around to also be doing the whole factories producing machining tools and expanding those beyond the levels we already have. We just don't at that point, whereas the Americans, of course, can delay their mobilization a little bit longer because they don't join the war till 1941. Really 1942, but 1941 is when they get involved, but 1942 is when you start the mass mobilization of people, once you start looking at the actual impacts on the economy. And yeah, so the British do buy a lot of machining tools from the Americans. So if you could have got that, made that order in 1938 as long with an aircraft, we could have ended up with the Brewster Buffalo, but we could have ended up with the Grumman Wildcat. And I think that would have been a really good design and a really good thing. And I'm looking forward to when key aircraft get around to the Wildcat and the Hellcat. But I'm starting off with the Bearcat, the less well-known one of them. And realistically, the Bearcat is the actual successor to the Wildcat. Far more than Hellcat is. The Hellcat is definitely a carrier aircraft. The Hellcat is a big, broad carrier aircraft. The Hellcat is a brawler of an aircraft. And, well, the US Navy and the Royal Navy are both sitting there going, we like the Wildcat. And honestly, the Hellcat is not as good at operating from escort carriers as the Wildcat. We want a replacement for the Wildcat from aircraft carriers. And they produce an absolutely gorgeous aircraft. An absolutely gorgeous aircraft. The F8F Bearcat is... it's the ultimate of the Grumman pugnacious fighter line. It truly is. And it's an aircraft which you can honestly say, if that had been available to the British or the Americans in the same time as the Wildcat, instead of the Wildcat, good Lord help anyone who fought them. It is an aircraft beyond others. In so many ways. Now, I always do a shameless book plug, so thank you to everyone who likes, shares, subscribes to videos. Thank you to everyone who engages and chats away, comments, and everyone who's a patron or a member of the channel or does Ko-fis or all the other things you can do to support the channel and the books. That really does matter and help the channel grow and help the channel keep going and help me buy books and help me do naughty things like have to buy extra packaging materials so I can keep this out of the crate, which was these sort of things were supposed to go in, because I wanted to have it for when recording this video. So it's now going to have to go into a special box of its own. Very kindly Drat gave me this, so I'm being very, very careful of it. And, well, I also always do, as said, it's a shameless book plug. Why do I do a shameless book plug in every video? Well, because I'm an academic. And our British academics, we are promoted, we are hired, we are... all our academic career, our chances are done because of the amount of books we sell and produce. And so, I advertise my books because no one else is going to. But I will. Because I like them. And I like Travels, Battles, and Darings. It's a great one about destroyers. It's a really good one about destroyers. F8F Bearcat, flying over US's Midway in 1949. Look at that aircraft. I know there's the title in front of it, but that just seemed to flow off it there. The ultimate pugnacious fighter. And let's be honest, if you are looking at those two aircraft, the F8F Bearcat and the Midway, in that form, you are looking at probably what the US Navy would ultimately really like to be operating in 1941 if there hadn't been the treaties, hadn't snarled everything up. I'm even talking about the fighter here, because one of the things that affects aircraft development, of course, is the number of aircraft being ordered, the amount of money going into aviation. If, with treaty limitations, you don't have so many carriers produced as possibly you would have, so you're not going to get as many aircraft ordered as you potentially would have, and that affects development pace. So treaties really do have an impact on a lot of things beyond just ship numbers. It's not just the ships which are affected, there's a lot of downstream orders of impact. And truly, the F8F is... it's built around power to weight ratio, which was felt to be the most important thing for a fighter in this time period. Power to weight ratio. And basically the idea was to wrap the smallest and lightest possible airframe that was still strong enough to do the job for carrier landings around the most powerful available engine. Put another way, if we go to here, you can see the power to weight ratios of our Grumman history. And as you can see, Grumman are fairly good. Now, what I have done here is, sometimes people give a power to weight ratio as an average of the aircraft's weight. And that is a perfectly respectable way to put it, and is the standard, the academic standard. And I did that during my PhD thesis. But a couple of years ago, I read a book which had decided that instead of giving it as an average, they gave you the band. What its power to weight ratio of the aircraft is empty, what it is at maximum weight, and you know therefore that its power to weight ratio is going to vary between that area. So it gives you an idea of the band. And that matters because on averages, aircraft can look very similar. But it could be that an aircraft has a very good power-to-weight ratio when it's empty, but a terrible one when it's fully loaded, and that affects its operations and performance. And that can be a real thing, a real problem. So here, and I've put it in imperial and in metric, but imperial is what they were working in at the time, so it's important to remember that's the criteria one. The power-to-weight empty ratio of the Wildcat and the Hellcat are both 0.24. The Bearcat's 0.29. The power-to-weight gross ratio of the Wildcat is 0.16, the Hellcat's 0.17, and the Bearcat is 0.17. So here, you get the point. Hellcat, Wildcat, Bearcat, if they are full, if they are completely fully loaded, honestly, their power-to-weight ratio is not that different. Not different enough to really give a commanding advantage. But the thing is, as they burn off fuel, as they drop bombs, as they get lighter, well, the Wildcat and Hellcat both have a very similar peak. The Bearcats, that goes higher. And you've got all the data down here which builds into that and provides you with some of the stats for it. Again, it's thanks to the engines, but it's also thanks to the engine they're working with. Slowly they're getting more and more out of that double wasp. Slowly they're getting more and more out of it and its capabilities. And as that engine evolves, they have got more capability. So basically you've got almost a Wildcat body with the Bearcat. It's a modifications. It's slightly bigger, slightly better. You know, the usual stuff. But it's very much designed to be as small as it can physically be. But it's around an engine which is an improved version of the engine which is going in that. And I have given the specific variants because the specific variants of the aircraft can have variances. So this is the point. Power-to-weight ratio is an important factor. It's the deciding factor in a lot of aircraft performance in the 1920s and 30s. Today we talk about streamlining, we talk about the aircraft design, we talk about them being designed, whether they're designed for stability or instability. You know, the era of modern aircraft which literally, because of their design, you cannot fly them without the computers working because they have to make that many adjustments to deal with the fact that the aircraft is fundamentally unstable. The reason it's fundamentally unstable is that makes it far more maneuverable in a dogfight, in a fighting maneuver. Something which, to an extent, you might want to get out of, but there again it gives probably a G advantage versus missiles. It's an interesting thing to debate and discuss. The power-to-weight ratio in this period is what is critical. That's why the engine race, the horsepower race, all these things are so important to development of aircraft. And again, you can apply this same metric when you start looking at things like Spitfires or Hurricanes or ME-109s or anything you want to talk about. You can go through that metric and you can start looking at power-to-weight ratios. That's when it starts to reveal some really interesting things about aircraft. Now, the other reason doing this methodology is useful is because if you're like me and you do a lot of power-to-weight ratios looking at torpedo bombers, because it's useful for them as well. We think about fighters, we think about maneuverability, but torpedo bombers, they need to get out of dodge quickly after they drop their torpedo. So actually, this really matters. Because you drop the torpedo and that's going to have a big impact. You know, that can take a aircraft from being far closer to this category, its full weight power-to-weight ratio, to its power-to-weight ratio empty. And that's a big thing. You can see the Swordfish. Swordfish is fairly maneuverable, fairly a stable aircraft when it's got a torpedo. The moment it drops its torpedo, it goes up. And you can really do some hard maneuvers in it. And that's a critical part of a torpedo attack aircraft. And something you have to think about when you're designing it. And again, goes with the dive bomber. All sorts of things, the power-to-weight ratio really does matter. But the reason Grom do like they do, and they're not going down, they're keeping it as consistent, but they're trying to make it better, is there's limitations on how dense you can make the airframe, how strong you can make the airframe for carrier operations, and how much power you can get out of the engine. So there's a limitation. Once you're fully loaded and you've got everything you want for all the range and all the things you want to do, that's what's going to affect that one. But if you've got enough power, then the same airframe or a very similar airframe can give you very different results. F8F has a far heavier, far stronger airframe in many ways than the Wildcat, and that explains why, despite having more power, it has the same empty weight ratio. The Bearcat, closer to the Wildcat, well, it also has more power, and that's why it has the ratio it has. If you look here on this chart, if we go across the empty weights in pounds, the Wildcat's 4,907 pounds, the Hellcat is 9,238 pounds, and the Bearcat is 7,650 pounds. Not quite in the middle of the two, but it's doing quite well. Gross weight for a Wildcat, 7,423 pounds. Hellcat, 12,598 pounds. And for a Bearcat, 13,460 pounds. These are the comparisons, and this is where the Bearcat comes in. This is where this glorious aircraft really does come in. It's the development of this line of thinking, of this doctrine. It's not like the Tiger Cat, which is a beautiful aircraft, but it's of course their twin-engined version. No, this is a full development, the absolute apogee of the pugnacious fighter design tree from Grom. And that fits. That really does fit. So try and start to look at this. It's an average-ish power-to-weight ratio given there. That's one of the ones I found in most of the books. I wanted to give you the power-to-weight ratio band first before I gave you the power-to-weight ratio that you find in most books. And again, that's something for future. Would you like me to do that as I do that in most of my own work? Would you like me to include the band in future as well as the average? Or rather the standard figure given in most of the books as the average. If you would, I'm very happy to do so. I'm looking at that myself, and it says 0.22 horsepower to pounds. I'm not quite sure. Well, I can guess where they're getting that from, but in my mental maths, if I was doing a perfect average of between the two, I would probably put it at 0.23 horsepower per pounds, as in the centre long way between the two. But most books do seem to go about one down. So it's slightly closer to the gross weight ratio than the empty weight ratio. I can accept that. I really can. I can accept that. Now, again, it's 28 foot 3 inches, or 8.61 meters long, and that's a fairly decent size, but it's not massive. When I say it's not massive, the Hellcat was 33 foot 7 inches, or 10.24 meters long, and the Wildcat was 28 foot 9 inches long, so it was 8.76 meters. So it's shorter in length than the Wildcat. Again, this aircraft, if it had been available in 1939 and the Royal Navy been able to get a hold of it, they would have been going, hallelujah. The thing you find at the end of World War II is a lot of the aircraft coming into service with the navies at this point are their dream aircraft from 1939. So if you consider the Royal Navy finally gets the fighter it really wanted in 1939. It's finally got the aircraft carriers it dreamed of wanting, it would dream of, and in service, and the likely success for aircraft that it carries in terms of design to them under construction. You know, that is the reality. In 1945, 1946, that is when the navies are getting what they dreamed of 6-7 years ago. Which I always think, for me, really does demonstrate the fact that world wars do not accelerate technological development. They really don't. They cause you to pluck a lot of technology that you're developing off the design already, that is at the point at which you can turn into practical, usable stuff into usable stuff. World wars see a lot of refinement of technology, not a lot of development of technology. And in this case, they are getting a truly capable aircraft. And frankly, the US Navy would have loved it a little bit earlier, because it's basically the Wildcat on steroids. And that might sound terrible to say, but I can't think of a better way of saying that. You've basically taken a Wildcat and you've gone, so you need a bigger, more powerful heart. Boom! There you go. You can now really run fast, super fast, and bigger lungs and all those things to really power you through. Its wingspan is 35 foot 10 inches. And again, the wingspan for that Wildcat, 38 foot. Or 11.5 meters, 11.58 meters versus 10.92 meters. The Hellcat, the wingspan is 42 foot 10 inches. So this is, in many ways, is the smallest of the family. It's the most pugnacious looking, I'd argue. But it's the smallest of the family. The wing area, the height, well, the height is, for the F8F is 13 foot 10 inches. The height for the Hellcat, 13 foot 1 inches. The height for the Wildcat, 11 foot 10 inches. So finally we found something where it's actually bigger than its predecessor's height. That's it. Height. Height. That's all. Wingspan area for the F8F, 244 square feet. The Hellcat, 334 square feet. The Wildcat, 260 square feet. So the fact that this does all it does, and it gets a top speed of 455 miles per hour to the Wildcat's 331 miles per hour, and the Hellcat's 391 miles per hour, is pretty much down to that power to weight ratio. It truly is. But that's not everything. You see, this aircraft is just too late for the end of the war, really, as well. It first comes into service in 21st of May 1945, and it doesn't get to have an active role. And that's a good thing in a way, because if it had an active role, that means it would have been involved in waging a war over Japan, because nuclear weapons had failed, or hadn't been used. And who knows of the horrific losses that could have been suffered by everyone in that scenario. But it does mean, rather like other aircraft I already discussed in Key Aircraft Series 1, it doesn't really get a reputation. One of the things I noted quite early on in this video series with aircraft is that they will get a reputation in their first implementation, whether it's good or bad. And the only thing that can really break them out of that is having a major event where they do something amazing or terribly. And that is what they'll be known as. That is what will form the narrative. The Bearcat doesn't really have that chance. Despite serving with the US Navy, US Marine Corps, Thailand, South Vietnam, i.e. the Republic of Vietnam Air Force, and the French, and doing sterling work over its years of service, and being in service from May 1945 to 1963, 18 years of valuable service, it doesn't really get that. And I'd say one of the big issues for it is that, well, there are 1,265 of these produced. The Hellcat, which, as I've said before, is pound for pound one of the best aircraft produced in World War II, is 12,275 aircraft. The Wildcat is 7,885 aircraft. So this aircraft is definitely a post-war production. You don't need as many. You don't want as many. You build nearly 1,300. And really that's too many for what you need it to do. For the amount of carriers you have in the operations. And it's also the beginning of the jet period. So the jets are the focus. Now, one of the really interesting things for me is that this aircraft did do a critical role. It did some great work in the Korean War, etc. It even goes to service with the Blue Angels, replacing the Hellcat. But it doesn't get its reputation. If we consider the aircraft that come out of the Korean War, with the replacement, with the sort of the reputation, are the Panther and the Banshee, the jet aircraft, because this is seen as old technology. I read a paper a few years back called Peaking Obsolescence or Forgotten Innovation. And it was all about these aircraft that come out after World War II. They're completely forgotten in so many ways from history books. People talking about the top 10 piston aircraft of all time. And you look at them and go, nope, not a single one of the post-World War II generation are in there. Not a single one. And they should be. Because if we go back to this side, it's very difficult to argue that the Bearcat is not better than the Hellcat and the Wildcat. It's very difficult to argue that fact. Its rate of climb, for example, which, let's be honest, especially pre-radar, was considered one of the most critical assets for fighters, because, and even post-radar, when you're talking about getting your your replacement cap, because as air defense goes, the cap goes to intercept the enemy attackers, the deck aircraft launched to replace the cap. This aircraft, a rate of climb of 4,605, or is that 655 from memory? 4,465, sorry. Completely misread it. Should not read it off the small screen. Should have it on a big screen next to it, shouldn't I? I'll put that back up. Completely eclipses the 2,600 feet a minute of the Hellcat or the 2,303 feet of the Wildcat. Even the 2,600 feet a minute, or 13 meters a second, of the Spitfire Mark 5B. Even that's eclipsed. Again, I'd like to point you to the earlier statement of the Royal Navy would have loved this aircraft in 1939. The US Navy would have loved this aircraft in 1939. The Royal Air Force would have given body parts for this aircraft in 1939. This is one of the problems you have with this later generation of piston aircraft. They are the absolute product of the period before. You now have airborne early warning. You now have lots of radar around. Rate of climb is still very useful, and maneuverability still matters, but it's not as critical before as other factors. overall speed, etc. And yes, this is fast. It is fast. But compared to a jet aircraft. And again, all these things compared to a jet aircraft. So, as good as the F8F is, as brilliant as the Bearcat is, it's just not what anyone's really wanting at this point. It's what they wanted 6 years ago. It's what they still wanted when they first made the order for this back in 1943, 42? When they're putting together the ideas of it. Pretty much they're starting to put the ideas of it together in 1942. The order and actual development theoretically doesn't begin till late 1943. But let's be honest, we want a super Wildcat. Yeah, that started earlier. The idea of that started earlier. And let's be honest, the legacy of that thinking goes back to the previous 5-10 years of fleet problems, of what the Royal Navy's been doing in their exercises, of watching and trying to assess and what the Japanese have been doing in China, what went on in the Spanish Civil War. All these things have filtered into this information and have made this the idea, but in many ways, this is still solving the old problem. If you want a good example of that, there's the whole joy they have with their wingtips during the design and development, where they are first designed to snap off, and then eventually that's replaced by them being blown off in high-stress situations. You could still fly the plane back, but it meant you didn't have to build the whole wing to be the same structural strength. So if in high Gs the wingtips become problematic, they snapped off. That was the theory. Unfortunately, factory production rather than experimental production turned out to be not quite as good. Okay, it turns out that when you have something being produced on an individual basis by master craftsmen versus being produced in a factory scenario where volume rather than artistry is the priority, because that's what makes sense. It didn't work quite to plan, so they ended up having to replace it with an explosive system. But still, 24 US Navy squadrons were equipped with the F8F, and the US Marine Corps had a slightly less number. They were, as mentioned earlier, the Blue Angels. They were highly maneuverable. And the other really interesting thing about their service history, especially the US Navy, was that these aircraft were actually a problem for jets entering service. It took years for jets to enter service that had better performance characteristics than the Bearcats. That's another problem when it comes to selling their history, people telling everyone about them when people discussing them, because, well, if your piston aircraft is better than your jets, you don't want to admit that in publicity at that time. You've got all the money's going into jets. They're the future. No one wants to admit how good the piston aircraft is. Still, it carried on serving even after it left the US Navy and US Marine Corps and went to serve with the French. And then 200 of them went to serve with the French, and then after they withdrew from what they were calling Indochina, what we would call Vietnam, they passed on the surviving ones to the South Vietnamese. Eventually, the Vietnamese Bearcats were replaced by Sky Raiders and Trojans. The Thais even got some F8Fs, and the thing is, Bearcats were very popular civilian-wise with people doing air racing. They are really easy to modify. They're really high performance. And things like the Rare Bear are produced, which is a record-breaking aircraft. So yeah, they have a good service history, but not a highly acclaimed service history. Because they're too late for World War II, which is the war they really were designed for. And by the time they enter service, the world's changed, the world's moved on. One of the things I talk about in the year of aircraft carriers, and I'm talking about as 2024 goes on, is the fact that you get periods of naval aviation and they evolve. And what you are looking for in terms of a fighter changes. And a fighter which is really good for one period, for one era of naval aviation, might not be good at how that theory is applied in the next period. This aircraft is armed with 20mm cannon. That's great. 5-inch rockets, that's great. This aircraft will be perfect for the navies in 1939, in 1941, in 1943. But it's not perfect for the navies in 1948. Because the world has moved on. The threat has moved on. The way you engage the threat has moved on. And so that brings us to the summary, and yeah, if you're looking at these aircraft and going, what are they, Alex? They're a very strange colour. Well, they're the 1946 Blue Angels. When, you know, these days when you see the Blue Angels perform, they're an amazing display team, but I think they missed the trick. I think that they should have kept these going, honestly. Just imagine the tricks they could be performing in an F8F Bearcat. Truly. One of the interesting things is they got F8F1s rather than F8F2s. The ones were, of course, the first generation. And the F8F2s are what sort of come into service 1948 onwards. And there are roughly 290 of those, and plus night fighter and reconnaissance variants produced. They're good aircraft. And I know I've said that a lot, but I really can't emphasize it enough. They're highly maneuverable aircraft. They are great display aircraft. They are the development of naval aviation you can trace. Development of fighter development you can trace from the Sopwith Pup, honestly, to the Graham F8F Bearcat. From the earliest fighters to this point. They are fighters coming into service in a period which is on the cusp of a technological change, where whilst the theory of operation, the strategic reasoning for operation, the doctrine, will not change in terms of the higher level, the operational doctrine, how you enact things, how you carry out things, will change. Because of the changing capabilities and different advantages and disadvantages presented by the new technologies coming into service. So that's these aircraft. The F8F Bearcat is a truly gorgeous aircraft, a truly capable aircraft, which comes too late. Which has a lot of potential, but not a lot of time to show it. And spends most of its life, when it is doing combat missions, doing ground support missions. Providing combat air support, and that's really... It can do that role, like all the pugnacious Grumman fighters can, but that's not really what it was designed for. That isn't what it was designed for. So, without much said, what's today's question? I've asked a lot of questions on this channel of things of, long lines of what happens if this ship is available early, what happens if this ship happens, or if war's delayed at this point. I think the biggest change you have for the Royal Navy and the US Navy and pretty much every navy in World War II era is if you cant the war forward to 1943-44. If you say make it later, as in cant it later, I said cant it forward, canting it backward. Bring it back to sort of 1944. The thing is, I think the US Navy could well be onto the Bearcat already. If you consider when she's ordered, what she's ordered for, I could have seen them already heading in that direction. Because this is a great way to maximize your numbers and your space in your hull. And yes, honestly, when they first come into service, the Hellcat is better for the long-range patrols. This is better for the interception role. But things change. So what I want you to think about is I want you to think about the generation of aircraft which are being developed in that period, which are starting to come into service, and would have probably come into service in 1944 if war hadn't been in place, or would have come into service soon after war beginning if war had started in 1944. And I want you to think about what the world is you'd be seeing. I highly doubt the Japanese would still be using Zeros. If by some chance war holds off till 1944, and we're going to hand wave him rather than give a causality here, but let's just say people give peace a chance. Everyone takes a little bit longer to get to the point at which they are stretching their muscles, whilst everyone is still building up. What do you think the aircraft we'd remember would be? If war holds off till starting till 1944, what are the aircraft that become our history of World War II? What are the Spitfires? What are the Corsairs? What are the Hellcats? What are the Hurricanes? What are the ME-109s? What are the Zeros? What are the fight aircraft we remember from a World War II which starts in 1944? It's an interesting question, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the subject. What else have we got coming up? Right then, next week we have conception, operation, and conclusion of the Lexington class, which will also include things like about the Panamax and other scenarios they have to deal with, because let's be honest, those are it's very specific criteria the US Navy end up having, which affects a lot of their carrier design. It doesn't affect anyone else's, and it's one of the interesting scenarios that you start looking and go, anyone else really worrying about the Panama Canal? No. Why not? Well, again, the example of the British canal they worry about is going to be the Suez, which is more about draft in this period than beam. So that's the interesting thing to watch with the British ships. We always think about canals as being restrictive in terms of but they're also restrictive in terms of and that's the point. And the Japanese, theoretically with none of those restrictions on them, because they're only worried about fighting in the Pacific, realistically, still have their own issues to worry about. What can their infrastructure actually sustain and construct? So that's what we're going to. That's to extent some of the discussions we're going to start getting into as the year goes on, looking at each navy's restrictions when we come to their design. So that's why we have Lexington class, Shikoku class, and following on from that, we have HMS Unicorn as the conception, operation, conclusion videos for next May and June. And in July, what do we have in July? We have the Bogue Ruler and Attacker class. and USS Ranger and USS Wasp. One of the interesting things here is I haven't included quite a lot about some of the Royal Navy carriers, but that's because I started up first by doing the whole thing of the British carrier naval aviation doctrine back in January, and by starting off with that, I felt, well, I've also done a video about the history of the Ark Royals as a name of carriers, and they're also I felt I'd done that earlier, so now it's sort of some of the American carriers are getting their focus on some of the Japanese carriers. It should be fun. I still can't believe I put Japanese World War II carrier naval aviation doctrine and Imperial Japanese Naval Aircraft Squadron systems in June and July when I'm moving house, setting up house, and sorting out all sorts of other issues, and possibly wandering around with the shipshape team. Why would I do that to myself? I do not know. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you found it a nice, genteel introduction to the Bearcat. And hope you consider them one of your favourite aircraft as well from now on. I certainly do.